Vegetation monitoring. An overview. Monitoring is the collection and analysis of repeated observations or measurements, and it is done to evaluate changes in conditions and to determine progress towards meeting resource management objectives. Please note that the repeated observations and measurements is a key aspect of monitoring. There are a number of applications for monitoring, and let's just consider a few here. In this case, we're using photo monitoring by looking at before and after photos of a riparian area after a fence was installed. And we want to look at the effect of the fencing or the management action on the vegetation resource. It's a little difficult to see the fence, but it follows that bright line in the lower image, and you can see in the foreground that the vegetation is quite different than it was before the fence. In another example, we can consider leafy spurge control using targeted grazing. In this case, targeted grazing by sheep was used to reduce leafy spurge cover and density. And it's through monitoring that we're able to detect the effect of the management action and the rate at which the cover and density of leafy spurge changed. Now, for all monitoring, it's always directly tied to and driven by resource management objectives. There are a number of important questions that we need to ask ourselves as we are preparing a monitoring plan. First, it's important to know what kind of information do we want to know. We want information that is going to inform management and that is related to the resource of interest. After we've asked ourselves that question, we need to do a double check and ask, why do we need to know this information? We want to make sure that the information we are going to get is directly related to our management objectives. This is important because monitoring any kind of data gathering can be very time expensive and cost expensive, and we want to make sure that we are using our resources best in order to inform management. When we determine what the monitoring protocol is going to be and our sampling design, that's when we ask ourselves, how are we going to gather this information? What exactly are we going to gather? And then also, how are we going to analyze it? You need to know how you're going to use the data and what kind of data you have. Finally, it's very important to already know how you're going to use it. It doesn't do us any good if we don't follow through with analyzing the data and then reporting it in light of our resource management objectives. Now, monitoring is a key aspect of the adaptive management cycle. Adaptive management always begins with defining and determining what our management objectives are for the resource. Once we have determined what our management objectives are, then we implement the management that we feel is going to allow us to meet those resource objectives. Of course, we need to monitor so that we can determine whether the management has made an effect on the resource in accordance to our objectives. And so monitoring is a key step of gathering information so that we know what the effect of our management was. Once we have gathered our monitoring data, we need to analyze that and determine whether or not the objective has been achieved. If it has been achieved, then that's what we were trying for, and we would either continue to implement the same management, or at a time when the resource objectives may change or need alteration, we may adjust management in accordance to those resource objectives. But if we assume that the resource objective stays the same, and after we have done our monitoring, we determine that the objective was not achieved, then this gives us the opportunity to adapt our management by designing and implementing an alternative management approach. Of course, once we've implemented that approach, we won't know whether it has helped us to reach our objective unless we continue to monitor the resource in light of our resource objectives. Note that monitoring is a key aspect in the cycle, and without monitoring, the cycle will be broken. Now, there's a range of different types of data gathering activities: monitoring, inventory, natural history studies, and experimental research. And they vary in their main intent or purpose, and also in how they are conducted. Inventory is a point-in-time measurement where we take information about the current status of the resource to use that as baseline assessment of the resource so that we can make plans or have an idea of what the resource values currently are. We often collect a broad array of information types in inventory, often related to vegetation, soils, structural improvements, water, etc. Natural history studies are a form of research. These usually are ecological or biological investigations, and they are usually observational, or what we may call natural experiments. What we mean by this is that we're looking at we're investigating phenomenon of natural systems as they are either responding to some sort of a perturbation or disturbance, or sometimes just to gather information about a species of interest. The important point here is that with natural history studies, usually experimental treatments are not applied. And so that brings us to experimental research. In this case, we have deliberate application of treatments to experimental units, and usually there are some units that are assigned to an untreated control group, meaning that certain units do not have a treatment applied. This gives us a greater amount of information to compare the effect of treatment by comparing it to a site that was not treated. In addition, with experimental research, we often have adequate replication for statistical inference, and because of the application of treatments and controls with adequate replication, we're able to determine cause and effect. That's the basis of experimental research. Now let's compare these data gathering activities in a different light. In this figure, which comes from the book Measuring and Monitoring Plant Populations by Elzinga et al., we see a continuum from left to right of information gathering approaches. Let's look at this in a little more detail. In this case, what we're considering is the management action is the application of a burn, so a prescribed burn. And if we start on the left and look at the first case, the burn is applied, but there is no information gathered. There's no monitoring, so no information. In the second case, we have monitoring that occurs after the burn, but there's no replication and there are no controls. So we implement the burn and then measure the response repeatedly after the management action was taken. In the next case, what's different is we plan the burn, but we decide to measure the resource before we implement the burn, then the burn is applied, and then we measure the resource afterwards. So we can do a before and after comparison of the response of the resource to the application of the burn. Now, what we don't have here is information about whether or not the response we see is because of the burn, or it could be because of some extraneous circumstances such as changes in climate and maybe a drought. So we may see some changes that are necessarily attributable to the burn. So in the next case, what we see is we implement ahead of time, we determine that this area is going to be burned, so it's going to be treated, and this area, which we assume is very similar, is assigned to be an untreated control. They are both measured, the burn is applied, and then after the burn, we would have post-burn measurements. Remember that we often measure more than once after the management application, but in these images they're only showing one. So in this case, we're able to see by looking at the difference between the control before and after and the difference between the treated area before and after, we can better elucidate the effect of burning on the site. Now in the next sequence, what we have is more replication. In this case, these areas here are selected because they are similar. They're predetermined that certain parts are going to be burned and not burned, and there's replication. The burn is applied and then we measure afterwards. Because of replication, we're better able to determine cause and effect by statistical inference. And in the last case, we see a more complicated research design in which there's excellent replication. All of the measurements are taken in each one of these units. The burn is applied to the treated units only, and then measurements are taken afterwards. It's important to note that in these cases here, B through D, we are able to detect information about the effect of management on the resource, but we don't have enough information to make statistical inferences. And it's when we get into the realm of research with treated and untreated areas and significant replication that we're able to make statistical inferences about cause and effect. Now, monitoring may be done for a number of reasons. First, we monitor sometimes in order to determine the long-term average status of resource. Resources may change, resource values may change in year-to-year variability, and so monitoring allows us to get an idea of what is normal on that piece of land. We often will use monitoring to evaluate systems that are at risk of crossing a threshold. Or we may use monitoring to evaluate areas that are recovering from a disturbance or some type of perturbation, and we want to be able to see whether the trend is in the direction that our management desires. Finally, we will use monitoring to inform management decisions in a short-term nature. So in conclusion, monitoring is an essential approach to determine how the resource responds to management actions. Monitoring involves repeated measurements or observations, and monitoring is a key component of the adaptive management cycle. Without monitoring, we can't inform our management in order to make decisions about whether we need to adapt management. Monitoring differs from other forms of data gathering activities in that it is designed primarily as an information gathering tool to inform management. And monitoring protocols are always driven by resource management objectives. More detail about developing monitoring protocols will be covered in subsequent lessons.